The Last Cruise of the Judas Iscariot by Edward Page Mitchell. She formerly showed the name Flying Sprite on her Starn Molden, said the Captain Trumbull Cram. But I had that gouged out and planed off, and Judas Iscariot and gilt sought there instead. That was an extraordinary name, said I. Extraordinary craft, replied the captain, as he absorbed another inch and a half of niggerhead. I'm neither a profane man nor an irreverend, but sink my jig if I don't believe the spirit of Judas possessed that schooner. Hey, Ammy. The young man addressed as Ammy was seated upon a mackerel barrel. He deliberately removed from his lips a black briar wood and shook his head with great gravity. The captain, said Ammy, is neither a profane or an irreverend. What he says he mostly knows, but when he sinks his jig, he allers to be depended on. Fortified with this neighborly estimate of character, Captain Cram proceeded. You larf at the idea of a schooner's soul. Perhaps you hae sailed him a 40-odd year up and down this here coast, and acquainted yourself with their dispositions and habits of mind. Hey, Ammy? The captain, explained the gentleman on the mackerel keg, has coasted and has fished for 46 year. He's lumbered and he's iced. When the captain sees fit for to talk about schooners, he understands the subject. My friend, said the captain, a schooner has a soul like a human being, but considerably broader of beam, whether for good or for evil. I ain't going to deny that I prayed for the Judas and Tuesday and Thursday evening meeting week after week and month arter month. I ain't going to deny that I interested Deacon Plimpton in the wrastle for her redemption. It was no use, my friend. Even the deacon's powerful petitions were clear waste. I ventured to inquire what manner this vessel had manifested its depravity. The narrative which I heard was the story of a demon of treachery with 3 masts and a jib boom. The Flying Sprite was the first 3-master ever built at Newhaven, and the last. People shook their heads over the experiment. No good can come to such a critter, they said. It's contrary to nature. 2 masts is mast enough. The Flying Sprite began its career of base improbity at the very moment of its birth. Instead of launching decently into the element for which it was designed, the 3-masted schooner slumped through the ways into the mud and stuck there for 3 weeks, causing great expense to the owners, of whom Captain Trumbull Cram was one of the extent of an undivided third. The oracles of Newhaven were confirmed in their forebodings. 2 masts is enough to sail the sea, they said. The 3rd is the devil's hitching post. On the first voyage of the Flying Sprite, Captain Cram started her for Philadelphia, loaded with ice belonging to himself and Lawyer Swanton, cargo uninsured. Ice was worth $6 a ton in Philadelphia. This particular ice had cost Captain Cram and Lawyer Swanton 85 cents a ton shipped, including sawdust. They were happy over the prospect. The Flying Sprite cleared the port in beautiful shape, and then suddenly and silently went to the bottom in Fiddler's Reach, in 11 feet of salt water. It required only 6 days to float her and pump her out, but owing to a certain incompatibility between ice and salt water, the salvage consisted exclusively of sawdust. On her next trip, the schooner carried a deck load of lumber from the St. Croix River. It was in some sense a consecrated cargo, for the lumber was intended for a new Baptist meeting house in southern New Jersey. If the prayerful hopes of the navigators, combined with the prayerful expectations of the consignees, had availed, this voyage at least would have been successfully made. But about 60 miles southeast of Nantucket, the Flying Sprite encountered a mild September gale. She ought to have weathered it with perfect ease, but she behaved so abominably that the church timber was scattered over the surface of the Atlantic Ocean, from about 40 degrees 15 minutes latitude to 43 degrees 50 minutes latitude. A month or two later, she contrived to go on her beam ends under a gentle land breeze, dumping a lot of expensively carved granite from the Fox Island quarries into a deep hole in Long Island Sound. On the very next trip, she turned deliberately out of her course in order to smash into the starboard bow of a Norwegian brig, and was consequently liable for heavy damages. It was after a few experiences of this sort that Captain Cram erased the old name from the schooner's stern and from her quarter and substituted that of Judas Iscariot. He could discover no designation that expressed so well his contemptuous opinion of her moral qualities. She seemed malignant perfidy. She was a floating tub of cussedness. A board of nautical experts sat upon the Judas Iscariot, but could find nothing the matter with her physically. The lines of her hull were all right. She was properly planked and sealed and caulked. Her spars were of good Oregon pine. She was rigged taut and trustworthy. And her canvas had been cut and stitched by a God-fearing sailmaker. According to all theory, she ought to have been perfectly responsible as to her keel. In practice, she was frightfully cranky. Sailing the Judas Iscariot was like driving a horse with more vices than hairs in its tail. She always did the unexpected thing, except when bad behavior was expected of her on general principles. If the idea was to luff, she would invariably fall off. If to jibe, she would come round dead in the wind and hang there like Mohammed's coffin. Sending a man to haul the jib sheet to windward was sending a man on a forlorn hope. The jib habitually picked up the venturesome navigator, and after shaking him viciously in the air for a second or two, tossed him overboard. A boom never crossed the deck without breaking somebody's head. Start on whatever course she might, the schooner was certain to run before long into one of three things, namely, some other vessel, a fog bank, or the bottom. From the day on which she was launched, her scent for a good sticky mud bottom was unerring. In the clearest weather, fog followed and enveloped her as misfortune follows wickedness. Her presence on the banks was enough to drive every codfish to the coast of Ireland. The mackerel and porgies were always where the Judas Iscariot was not. It was impossible to circumvent the schooner's fixed purposes to ruin everybody who chartered her. If chartered to carry a deck load, she spilled it. If loaded between decks, she dived and spoiled the cargo. She was like one of the trick mules which, if they cannot otherwise dislodge the river, get down and roll over and over. In short, the Judas Iscariot was known from Marblehead to the Bay of Chaleur as the consummate schooneration of malevolence, turpitude, and treachery. After commanding the Judas Iscariot for 5 or 6 years, Captain Cram looked fully 20 years older. It was in vain that he had attempted to sell her at a sacrifice. No man on the coast of Maine, Massachusetts, or the British provinces would have taken the schooner as a gift. The belief in her demoniac obsession was as firm as it was universal. Nearly at the end of the season, when the wretched craft had been even more unprofitable than usual, a conference of the owners was held in the Congregational Vestry one evening after the monthly missionary meeting. No outsider knows exactly what happened, but it is rumored that in the 2 hours during which these capitalists were closeted, which led to significant results and to a singular decision. On the forenoon of the next day, there was a general suspension of business at Newhaven. The Judas Iscariot, with her deck scoured and her spars scraped till they shone in the sun like yellow amber, lay at the wharf by Captain Cram's fish house. Since Monday, the captain and his 3 boys and Andrew Jackson's son Tobias from Mackerel Cove had been busy loading the schooner deep. This time her cargo was an extraordinary one. It consisted of nearly 1/4 of a mile of stone wall from the boundaries of the captain's shore pasture. "I calculate," remarked the commander of the Judas Iscariot as he saw the last boulder disappearing down the main hatch, "there's nigh 250 ton of stone fence aboard that schooner." Conjecture was wasted over this unnecessary amount of ballast. The owners of the Judas Iscariot stood up well under the consolidated wit of the village. They returned witticism for witticism, and kept their secret. "If you must know, I'll tell you," said the captain. "I hear there's a stone wall famine over Mackay's way. I'm going to take mine over and peddle it out by the yard." On this fine, sunshiny Friday morning, while the luckless schooner lay on one side of the wharf, looking as bright and trim and prosperous as if she were the best-paying maritime investment in the world, the Tug-Pug of Portland lay under the other side, with steam up. She had come down the night before in response to a telegram from the owners of the Judas Iscariot. A good land breeze was blowing, with the promise of freshening as the day grew older. At 7:30 the schooner put off from the landing, carrying not only the captain's pasture wall, but also a large number of his neighbors and friends, including some of the solidest citizens of Newhaven. Curiosity was stronger than fear. "You know what critter," the captain had said, in reply to numerous applications for passage. "If you ever mind to risk her antics, come along and welcome." Captain Cram put on a white shirt and a holiday suit for the occasion. As he stood at the wheel, shouting directions to his boys and Andrew Jackson's son Tobias at the halyards, his guests gathered around him, a fair representation of the gait of respectability, the business enterprise, and the piety of Newhaven Harbor. Never had the Judas Iscariot carried such a load. She seemed suddenly struck with a sense of decency and responsibility, for she came around into the wind without balking, dived her nose playfully into the brine, and skipped off on the short hitch to clear Tumbler Island, all in the properest fashion. The Pug steamed after her. The crowd on the wharf and the boys in the small boats cheered this unexpectedly orthodox behavior. And they now saw for the first time that Captain Cram had painted on the side of the vessel in conspicuous white letters, each 3 or 4 feet long, the following legend: "This is the schooner Judas Iscariot, N.B. Give her a wide berth." Hour after hour, the schooner bounded along before the northwest wind, holding to her course as straight as an arrow. The weather continued fine. Every time the captain threw the log, he looked more perplexed. 8, 9, 9.5 knots. He shook his head as he whispered to Deacon Plimpton: "She's meditating mischief of some nature or other." But the Judas led the Pug a wonderful chase, and by the 2:30 in the afternoon, before the demijohn which Andrew Jackson's son Tobias had smuggled on board was 3/4 empty, and before Lawyer Swanton had more than 3/4 finished his celebrated story about Governor Purington's cork leg, the schooner and the tug were between 50 and 60 miles from land. Suddenly Captain Cram gave a grunt of intelligence. He pointed ahead where a blue line just above the horizon marked a distant fog bank. "She smelt it and she run for it," he remarked sententiously. "Time for business." Then ensured a singular ceremony, Captain Cram brought the schooner to and transferred all his passengers to the tug. The wind had shifted to the southeast, and the fog was rapidly approaching. The sails of the Judas Iscariot flapped as she lay ahead to the wind. Her bows rose and fell gently under the influence of the long swell. The Pug bobbed up and down, half a hawser's length away. Having put his guests and crew aboard the tug, Captain Cram proceeded to make everything shipshape on the decks of the schooner. He neatly coiled a loose end of rope that had been left in a snarl. He even picked up and threw overboard the stopper of Andrew Jackson's son Tobias's demijohn. His face wore an expression of unusual solemnity. The people on the tug watched his movements eagerly, but silently. Next he tied one end of a short rope to the wheel and attached the other end loosely by means of a running bowline to a cleat upon the rail. Then he was seen to take up an axe and to disappear down the companionway. Those on the tug distinctly heard several crashing blows. In a moment the captain reappeared on deck, walked deliberately to the wheel, brought the schooner around so that her sails filled, pulled the running bowline taut, and fastened the rope with several half-hitches around the cleat, thus lashing the helm, jumped into a dory, and sculled over to the tug. Left entirely to herself, the schooner rolled once or twice, tossed a few bucketfuls of water over her dancing bows, and started off toward the South Atlantic. But Captain Trumbull Cram, standing in the bow of the tugboat, raised his hand to command silence, and pronounced the following farewell speech. being sentence, death warrant, and funeral oration all in one. I ain't advancing no theory to account for her cussedness. You all know the Judas. Maybe thar was too much fore and aft to her. Maybe the iniquity of her vessels in the fore and aft, and the vartue in the squar rigging. Maybe two masts was mast enough. Let that go. Bygones is bygones. Yonder she goes, carrying all sail on top, 200-odd ton of stone fence in her hold, and a whole good 2 feet across stove in her belly. The way of the transgressor is hard. Don't you see her settling? It should be a lesson, my friends, for us to profit by. There's an end to the long-sufferingest mercy, and unless... Oh, you're making straight for the fog, are you? Well, it's your last fog bank. The bottom of the sea's the first port you'll fetch, you critter. You get and be dead to you. This, the only occasion on which Captain Cram was ever known to say such a word, was afterward considered by a committee of discipline of the Congregational Church at Newhaven, and the committee, after pondering all the circumstances under which the word was uttered, voted unanimously to take no action. Meanwhile, the fog had shut in around the tug, and the Judas Iscariot was lost to view. The tug was put about and headed for home. The damp wind chilled everybody through and through. Little was said. The contents of the demijohn had long been exhausted. From a distance to the south was heard, at intervals, the hoarse whistling of an ocean steamer. "I hope that feller's well under it," said the captain grimly, "for the Judas'll never go down afore she's sarched him out and sunk him." "And was the abandoned schooner ever heard of?" I asked, when my informant had reached this point in the narrative. The captain took me by the arm and led me out of the grocery store down to the docks. Across the mouth of the small cove back of his house, blocking the entrance to his wharf and fish house, was stretched a skeleton wreck. "There she lays," he said, pointing to the blackened ribs. "That's the Judas. Did you suppose she'd sink in deep water, where she could do no more damage? No, sir, not if all the rocks on the coast of Maine were piled onto her, and her hull bottom knocked clean out. She come home to roost. She come 60 mile in the teeth of the wind. When the tug got back next morning, there lay the Judas Iscariot across my cove, with her jib boom struck through my kitchen winder. I say schooners has souls."